And joining us now on the debate, in Naples, Florida, Alan Pope, former Ontario cabinet minister and author of a 2006 report on the Saskatchewan crisis. In Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, on the Rankin Reserve via Skype, Dean Sayers, chief of the Batchewana First Nation. And with us here in studio, Christopher Alcantara, professor in the Department of Political Science at Wilfrid Laurier University, Hayden King, professor of Indigenous Studies at McMaster University. It's good to have you two gentlemen here in the studio, and to our friends in Points Beyond, thank you for joining us today for the second part of our discussion. We had Paul Martin, the former Prime Minister, here yesterday. We're happy to have you four following up today. Here's John Ivison in the National Post from a couple of months ago, writing, 6 years ago, Saskatchewan was hit by an E. coli outbreak in its water supply, caused by a plugged part the local operators of the treatment plant had not been trained to fix. The community was evacuated, and a report by former Ontario Cabinet Minister Alan Pope recommended moving the entire reserve south to Timmins. He concluded that the health and infrastructure problems in Saskatchewan made it untenable as a sustainable community. The feds offered to fund the move, but residents refused to leave their traditional lands. Despite being plagued with social problems like alcohol and drug abuse, family violence and suicide, the pull of the land proved too great. If you lose your ties to the land, you lose who you are, said one Cree resident. Alan Pope, you're the guy who wrote that study. We've got you here tonight. Tell us, based on what you know, has anything changed?
Not dramatically. We still have the same kind of problems. A lot of them are insoluble, quite frankly. But my feeling is that no, not much has changed dramatically.
Chief Sayers, the importance of the land, as it was expressed by one of the local residents there. You know, for people in the South, they may not understand why, if your community is disintegrating around you, why you wouldn't just leave. So help us understand the importance of the land.
Well, those are key. That's one of the key components to our understanding of nationhood. Land is centrifugal. We have a relationship with our environment. We have a relationship with the land. It's a part of us. It sustains us. It's our friend. We have to maintain our ties, maintain our teachings, maintain our nationhood. And that's where we're going to find once again, our balance, our, I guess, overall, our feeling of comfort as a people.
Understood.
Land is centrifugal.
Chris, you co-authored a book with Tom Flanagan, a well-known former Harper advisor, about private ownership of homes. What would introducing the idea of private home ownership do you think, to this situation?
Well, I mean, this proposal is not one that's going to be appropriate for all First Nations. It's something that came out of an idea that Manny Jules has put forward, and so we helped him develop the idea. And the idea of property ownership would be that it would be good for some reserves, but it's not a panacea. It's not going to solve the problems where in northern reserves where you don't have significant amounts of economic development or economic development potential. So it's going to be appropriate for some reserves, but not necessarily for all reserves.
What do you think, though, Hayden, it would change if the notion of private ownership, private property were brought into this?
I don't really think it would change much, particularly in communities like Attawapskat or Saskatchewan. As Christopher mentions, it's not going to fit. It's not going to work for all communities. I don't think it's going to work for a lot of communities generally, not only because of the difference in just conceptions of property. A lot of most First Nations conceive of land as being communally held. Dividing it into individual plots is just kind of counter to a lot of cultural assumptions about the land. And of course, what kind of market is there for moldy, overcrowded homes? I don't think it exists.
Alan Pope, you made your recommendations almost 6 years ago right now. Is there anything, given the additional knowledge, information you have over the 6 years, that you would change in terms of recommending a better way forward for the groups that you looked at?
Well, I think, first of all, I understand the importance of land to a cultural identity and cultural activities. But clearly, members of isolated reserves, First Nations members, are making that decision with their feet. We've got 7,000 First Nations members in our community of Timmins right now who have come off of those reserves, who have decided that having a good life for themselves and their families is equally as important as a cultural attachment to the land. So these changes are taking place. I just want to say that. Secondly, I don't see much improvement in the way there isn't any national housing policy, either in the Department of Indian Affairs or emanating from any Aboriginal organizations. And until there is, we're going to be thrashing around here. We have homes that are in flood-prone lands. They have a mold problem. They don't even have proper dehumidification equipment in the homes or venting systems. They're poorly insulated, and there's too many people living in basements because there are not enough bedrooms in a 2-bedroom bungalow to accommodate 8 to 10 people. And until these basic changes are made to both the design of the homes and the way they're constructed and the way they're maintained, nothing is going to change. And to me, I think it's time to look at private ownership, quite frankly, and some reserves in around Timmins have done precisely that because they feel it's the way to go forward.
Chief Sayers, I need you to get to react to that. As important as the land is, does Alan Pope have a good point about living in completely unacceptable conditions?
Yeah, I think when I look and I think about the housing conditions, and it's no different in any community, First Nation community from my perspective in Canada, at least on the most part, the problem isn't that the housing situation. I think that's more of a symptom. I think there's core root causes to the overall life or quality of life of First Nations people in First Nations lands in Canada. And I think about why do First Nations people who pay the biggest tax of anybody in Canada, why are they living in substandard conditions? Why are we living in substandard conditions? We said we would share our lands. We said that we would share fairly, not 0.01% of the value of a mine or whatever. We expect 50% of the resources. If we were to get that annual transfer to our people based on the overall value of the extractions, we would have no problem providing an equitable level, quality of housing for all our people. We have real struggles in the north being able to provide equitable, quality housing because, first of all, I think the cost of all of our ingredients to build a house, for lack of a better word right now, those things cost 3 times more. A gallon of milk costs like $14 or for 4 liters, or a bag of milk. That's unheard of. That's inappropriate. We expect the fulfillment of our treaty relationship to happen, and we expect it to happen ASAP. We can no longer live in these types of housing conditions. We expect the same quality of life as mainstream Canadians. We expect it, and we have the documentation to prove that we will eventually attain that quality of life with equitable housing.
Okay, we want to get some follow-up here in Toronto. Hayden, you wanted to say?
Yeah, I think that both Alan and Dean have good points. The federal government's operating on a 1996 policy that they've been criticized by the Auditor General for in 2003 and 2006. Lack of resources, lack of coordination between INAC, Aboriginal Affairs Northern Canada, Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation, and the First Nations. And Dean also has a really good point. We asked this question about the sustainability of First Nation communities, but what about the sustainability of Canada? I mean, the obligations that we have towards each other as Indigenous peoples and Canadians, as Dean pointed out, Canadians, the wealth and prosperity of this country comes from the lands and resources of Indigenous peoples. And yet when we say, it costs money to sustain these isolated or remote communities, well, that's part of the relationship.
Chris?
Yeah, I agree. I think we have clearly constitutional and treaty obligations to make these reserves viable, to help Indigenous peoples choose where they want to live. And I think the main goal of the federal government and the provincial government should be to find ways to be creative and allow for a multitude of ways for dealing with this issue. So I don't think there's going to be a national strategy or one solution to this problem. It's going to be about listening to Indigenous communities, engaging in the research, and offering a variety of solutions to First Nations living in remote reservations.
Okay, I want to remind everybody that we're looking at whether or not these reserves are sustainable, as we have from a housing point of view. We're also going to look at it from an educational point of view and from health services point of view. Before we do that, Michael Smith, I think you've got a map in that control room. Let's bring that up and just give our viewers a sense about how widespread an issue we're talking about right now. Look at that map of Ontario. There are red dots all over that map of remote reserves, which are facing a variety of life-threatening issues, frankly, from the northwest of this province to the southwest to eastern Ontario. They seem to be almost everywhere. And to that end, let me read now an editorial from the Toronto Star that came out just a few days ago, and it goes like this. On the issue of education, hundreds of children in the Northern Ontario community of Pekangicum were sent home from school last week with no word on when they'll get to come back. This is just the latest example of a system that fails Native students so badly that only 40% graduate from high school compared to 80% of other Canadians. Without a good education, First Nations youth have little hope of ever breaking free from the poverty and despair that plague their isolated communities. So it's easy to see why Prime Minister Stephen Harper wants to focus on education at a January 24th summit meeting with First Nations leaders. Native education, long underfunded by Ottawa, is a near complete failure. It always has been. It needs a dramatic overhaul. Okay, Chief Stairs, let me go to you first on this. Would you agree that the state of Native education in Ontario today is, quote, in a near complete failure, and it always has been?
Oh, definitely. We recognize in our particular community, I think we're in an urban area, so we've got some successes. We've got doctors, lawyers, but I think we also recognize that the curriculums are nowhere near where they need to be more inclusive of the reality of what it means to be a First Nations person. We look at the curriculum where there is very little cultural pride, individual pride instilled within our members. We recognize the remnants of the residential school experience yet, where a lot of our, I guess, life skills were taken away. We struggle as leadership now to be able to come up with a more appropriate vehicle to be able to provide our people with really good quality education that will help them achieve their outcomes that they expect in their lives. It's a real challenge working in the existing system. We look at education renewal for our post-secondary students. We have a very successful program that's working miraculously right across Canada. And we really produce a lot of graduates. And when something is working now, Canada's trying to change it and take away, I guess, our abilities to manage the program under the current policy framework we have. And why fix something that's not even broken? So we're working to make sure that our numbers continue to increase for our post-secondary graduates, as well as the curriculum development. We're going to a summit putting forward a center of excellence perspective, our idea with early learning years, 0 to 6 year olds.
Okay, Chief, let me jump in for a second because I want to make sure I spread the time evenly here.
Sure.
Let me ask Alan Pope this. So, you know, obviously as a former Ontario cabinet minister, you know better than anybody that 99% of the education services in this country are provided by provinces, not the federal government. Paul Martin, the former Prime Minister, was here last night basically to tell us that what education the federal government does provide, they do an awful job at because they so badly underfund it compared to everything else. Do you think it would make more sense and improve the state of Aboriginal education in Ontario if the feds just gave the money to Ontario and said, you guys do it?
Well, that's an interesting concept, but I think one of the problems is people are making generalizations. We're talking about remote reserves in Northern Ontario. The reserves that I have been involved with in the past as a legal advisor and through my studies include Attawapskat, Kasatchewan, Moose Factory, and Fort Albany. These communities have education authorities. They are agencies of the band councils. They are run by boards of directors who are community members. They are the ones who are making decisions, along with Ottawa granted, on course content and on what the education system will consist of. I found in Kasatchewan that they weren't teaching math and sciences. So how can you get someone trained to operate a water system or a sewer system if they can't get into the course to be accredited because they haven't taken math or sciences at high school? But on the other hand, Attawapskat has a very successful education system, although they had problems with high school facilities. That's a long-standing problem. But there, they've got a very successful system. So I'm not going to generalize. I think that communities who have made education a priority have been able to succeed and have been able to give the children a good basic education. The problem you have is if they come out of the system and they're not ready to go to post-secondary education, they have to take additional years of upgrading in facilities far from home. And that creates a family problem, a family cost that is very difficult to bear. So I think, with all respect to Paul Martin, it's easy to generalize, but it's not something that can be generalized that way.
Okay, for what it's worth, Mr. Martin did not suggest that. He just said the federal government was doing a terrible job underfunding education. Chris, you wanted to say.
Well, I think it's a good idea to clarify responsibilities. I think the Crown has long passed the buck as much as possible and didn't want to deal with an issue. So clarifying responsibilities between the federal and provincial government is always a good thing. But I think the solution is going to come down to empowering First Nations, and not individual First Nations, but in creating First Nations school boards. I think this is the right way to go, by creating First Nation school boards whose jurisdictions are broader than beyond the First Nation. It allows for one thing, a pooling of expertise and resources, right? Instead of each First Nation having to invest significant resources in building a governance structure for dealing with this type of matter, what school boards provide, the opportunity to pool resources and deliver services more effectively and efficiently.
Can you explain to me, Hayden, how it's possible for First Nations to be educating high school kids and not teaching them math or science?
I think it's pretty rare, actually, that high schools exist in First Nation communities in the far north. I think, I'm not sure what the numbers are, but I think there's only 2 high schools on First Nation communities in all of the province. So generally they leave the community, go to Thunder Bay, go to Timmins, to go to high school, and so of course they receive the same education that their non-native colleagues receive.
Chief Sayers, how is that possible that there could be, admittedly, as Alan Pope suggested, the record is spotty, but how is it possible that maths or sciences wouldn't be taught in a First Nations high school?
Well, my understanding is that we teach Ontario's curriculums and Ontario's expectations within all of our institutions, depending on what they are. However, we're really concerned with the removal of our kids going to schools in foreign cities. Our nation has a treaty relationship. We expect our educational needs to be met based on our requirements, based on what we deem as the needs for our people.
Oops, it looks like we're having a little issue there with the Skype. Seems to have lost our signal there, but we'll try and recapture the signal there up to northwestern Ontario. And in the meantime, maybe Alan Pope, you could follow up on that. How is it possible that this isn't being taught?
Well, I think it's a real gap, and I think it's not acceptable. I didn't find it was acceptable, and I know the teachers that were teaching in Cache didn't find it acceptable. I would say, just to give some perspective here, I found that there was $18 million a year being spent on the community of Saskatchewan in transfer payments from the federal government. About half of that was going to the education system. So I think there is a significant contribution. I wouldn't want your viewers to feel otherwise. Whether or not it's the most efficient system or whether or not it cannot be improved, I'm not prepared to argue that point. I think everything can be improved in these First Nation communities on these reserves. But there is significant money being spent on education.
Hayden?
Significant money, and yet Attawapskat hasn't had a school for over a decade, right? And that's one of the examples that Alan brings up to demonstrate a success story. A community without a school has not had a school.
Period.
No, of
full
course.
Stop. Elementary, secondary, nothing.
No, they teach out of portables, and of course this has been an issue that's been raised in the media, certainly among First Nation peoples for the past decade. It was.
Well, let me understand this. You say they don't have a school, or they don't have a building?
They don't have a proper school, a proper building.
So
their proper school is contaminated by diesel fuel about a decade ago.
And presumably your position is it's not acceptable.
Well,
you
I
can't
think
learn like that.
Well, certainly not. And I think that it's kind of a myth to talk about the tremendous amount of resources that are being directed to First Nation education. It's been a policy of neglect, not dissimilar from housing. So when the Auditor General tells us that things are getting worse with housing, she says the same thing with education. 2004, she does a study that tells us that it's going to take 27 years to close the gap in education. 4 years later, she looks at it again, tells us it's going to take 28 years to close the gap. I mean, the issue is we talk about the amount of resources that are devoted, but clearly they're not enough.
Okay, Chief Sayers, well, I think we've reconnected with you right now, so let me pick up from there. How difficult is it for Aboriginal children to learn in
And that goes right across the board. I've had some discussions with some leadership in the far north, and they complain about the lack of capital that comes with program dollars. And it's not just in relation to education, but I think across the board. And the leadership across the country, Ontario in particular, are really frustrated with the continued agenda to remove our kids and have them educated in a foreign area. And if there needs to be 132 education agreements with First Nations in Ontario, well, so be it. We'll find successes that way. Right now, I don't believe we're aspiring to the level of successes that we would like to see happen with regards to the education of our children. And we notice that with the data that we see with the failure, the dropout rates in high school, et cetera.
Okay, we are reminding our viewers tonight that we're looking at the sustainability of remote reserves in the province of Ontario. We've taken a look from the housing point of view, from the education point of view, and now I want to look at a third area, healthcare. And to that end, let me read this from the Ottawa Citizen. Tiny fly-in reserves in northwestern Ontario have become ground zero for addiction to the synthetic opioid OxyContin. The drug is a growing public health problem across Canada, but the scale of abuse and addiction on northern Ontario reserves is like nowhere else, according to a growing body of health research. These communities do not have the extreme housing situation of Attawapiskat, but by southern Canadian standards, their housing is substandard and in some cases much worse, and they face numerous other challenges. Okay, Chris, start us off here. Let's get into a bit of a discussion about this. Why so much drug abuse on remote reserves?
Well, think of this, I think history is clear that Indigenous communities were healthy and prosperous prior to contact. The Canadian state arrives, it forcibly removes them to residential schools, it bans their governance structures, imposes foreign and quasi types of private property. And basically, this is the result of colonialism. So, if you rip a community apart, you move them, you destroy their culture. This is what you get. And ultimately, healthcare, the health conditions on reserves reflect this fact.
Alan Pope, do you agree with that analysis?
I think again it's easy to generalize. I think there is a healthcare issue, there is a health issue, there are addiction issues, there are alcohol abuse issues. And these are not just in reserves or First Nation communities. That takes place in many isolated communities across northern Canada, northern Ontario. There are health clinics. Attawapiskat has a clinic that I actually opened in 1985 when I was Minister of Health. Saskatchewan has a federal clinic that's manned by federally hired nurses. But it's really is inadequate. The transfer system for treatment of either people with addictions or people with health issues is a very archaic system that transports people to Kingston of all places instead of using local facilities in Timmins and Sudbury and other communities. So there's much that has to be improved upon. But again, it's hard to make great generalizations about access to medical care in isolated reserves. I may add, by the way, without trying to dwell on something too long, Attawapiskat has an elementary school and a secondary school is under construction next year.
Okay, appreciate you clarifying that. Chief Sayers, let me try this with you. Is it and there's no bias behind this question, just let's be clear about that. I'm not trying to lean one way or another in the way I ask this question. I'm just asking it. Is it fair in 2012 to say that too many kids on Aboriginal reserves in this province have drug problems because of the after effects of colonialism?
It's deplorable. And I think, at least from what we see as trends with First Nations communities, there is a complete failure of the fulfillment of the treaty obligations that Canada has inherited with regards to the relationship with First Nations people.
So it is colonialism,
had this
you
not
believe?
been, had it not been for this continual attack of our language, our land, and taking away our spirituality and taking away all those things, this wouldn't be the case today. We had a perfect society, and we can once again find that balance. I think that these are symptoms that we're seeing. Let's address the root causes. Let's provide the proper level of support. Canada needs to do that. And we are owed the same quality of life as every other Canadian. We shouldn't be struggling and standing there with our hands out. These are legal obligations Canada has to fulfill. We do have higher incident rates of health issues, diabetes for one thing. Take away our whole diet, put our elders in jail for most of their life for hunting, for going around the community and say, did you have meat for supper tonight? And if you did, your father gets thrown in jail. Those are memories of our elders. And so they take away our natural foods and replace it with fast foods. And now we're feeling the repercussions. Again, there's a genocidal attempt to eliminate the glorious red man again. And this is really unfortunate today that we have all these health issues. And they're so, I guess, preventable.
Okay, I got it. Let me jump in for a
this,
second, Chief,
this
because
opportunity for reconciliation.
I do want to jump in for a second, Chief Sayers, because you used a pretty heavy word there, and I want to make sure we're clear on this. You think the government of Canada has been engaged in genocidal contact against the First Nations of this country?
I think we look at a systemic genocidal policy that happens in a number of fronts. We look at the removal of our kids and place them in educational institutes. We look at the removal of our kids and placed in child welfare institutes. There's been a tremendous amount of institutionalizations that have taken place for and with our people for a very, very long time. And we can see now where that has taken us. It's taken away our land, it's taken away our language, it's taken away our spirituality, it's taken away our law, and it's eroded our original reservations within our treaty relationship. And I call that genocide.
Okay, let me go to Hayden King.
Well, it's hard to argue with Chief Sayers, and if you look at the United Nations Declaration on the Convention of Genocide, Canada's policies towards Indigenous peoples qualify to 3 out of the 4. But to health, you know, I hang out with old people in my community once a month, and we talk about priorities. You know, what should we be focusing on? And
Which community?
Christian Island, Chimnasing. And they talk about health as being the number one priority, but they don't talk about it as, you know, as you'd expect old people to talk about it when you need nurses and doctors. They talk about it as this problem of addiction. They talk about it as drugs, and they call it the sickness of colonization that we need to heal from. And that's what healthcare is to a lot of people in First Nation communities. And you know, it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a long time to heal from this. It took 150 years to scramble the moral, social codes, customs, values of Indigenous peoples, and scrambling's the easy part. It's going to take generations to reestablish, reinvigorate our societies, but it's, you know, something that's absolutely critical.
Alan Pope, I really should offer you an opportunity to respond to something the Chief said a moment ago, which is, I know you didn't work for the government of Canada, you worked for the government of Ontario, but maybe by extrapolation, do you feel that somehow your government, in the way it did not or did contribute to this issue, contributed to the genocide of a people in this country?
Well, I'm not going to argue with the historical perspective of the Chief. Obviously, he's speaking from the heart, and he has some basis for some of his comments. When we're talking about addictions and drug dependency and alcoholism, there is some of these reasons that exist, but there's also some responsibility that has to be accepted by families and communities to help do something about this. And we had that discussion in Saskatchewan with the Band Council when I was doing my report. So that, yes, there have been some problems in the past, and yes, I understand the historical perspective that the Chief is speaking to, but we have to move on and we have to do something to make things better for people.
Chris?
Well, I would say, you know, think of it this way. You know, you have historically, you have Indigenous communities that function well, were able to live off the land. Then you have the Canadian state comes in and relocates them and eliminates their culture and says, forget about living off the land. You know, here's modern education, here's farming. It doesn't work out, and so you have a number of Indigenous communities that have forgotten those traditions. I mean, that's the arguments of a number of Indigenous scholars, including Taiyaki Alford, who suggests that they used to remember how to live off the land. That's gone. And
you think that skill can be relearned?
That's the thing that he argues that those traditions can be relearned. You can, especially in these remote communities, you can, if Indigenous communities want that, then there's that possibility to reinvigorate the traditions and to returning to living off the land and making these communities sustainable in that way.
Hayden, one more word on this?
I guess, I mean, I didn't really want to have a conversation about genocide, but there was one comment that Alan made that I think that we need to clarify, or not clarify, but follow up on, that this is an ongoing phenomenon, that colonization is over, but the reality that it isn't, it's ongoing. We have these policies of neglect when it comes to education and healthcare, and it's easy for Canadians, it's convenient for Canadians and Ontarians to say that we don't have responsibility. It's a thing of the past. But if we're proud of our history, if we're proud of our achievements as Canadians, we also have to be ashamed and take responsibility for the faults of this country and its policies as well.
Understood. We had a guy named Clint Davis on the program last night. If you don't know who he is, go to our website. Watch last night's program again, because he was on with Paul Martin and a couple of others. And here's something he wrote in the Financial Post last month as we talk about economic opportunities. Attawapiskat, he wrote, is an aha moment for Canada. Despite billions of dollars in development, some communities are struggling to meet the basic needs of their citizens. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis have made remarkable progress in business in the past 20 years, and I believe the future remains very bright. However, it is not up to the Victor Mines of the world to absolve the federal government of its responsibility to fund communities so they will have the infrastructure that so many take for granted. The reference to Victor Mines, of course, being the diamond mine that De Beers owns up north. Let's talk about, we've talked about housing, education, we've talked about access to health care. The road forward, so many believe, is in economic development. And let's get a sense about where we are on that. Chief Sears, would you agree with Clint's comment that there has been, in his words, remarkable progress in business in First Nations communities in this province?
Well, I think it's improving, and that's, I think, based on the efforts of First Nations themselves, really, I guess, aligning themselves with a more educated perspective in regards to the ownership of the resources on the lands in Ontario. We know through our research that we agreed to share, and that we were all going to benefit from that, and underlying are all of these resources that we continue to retain ownership of. And we are aligned with the perspective that's also adopted within the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, that any developers, including Canada, needs our consent if they want to extract. And before they garner our consent, there are going to be benefits agreements, there's going to be impact agreements, there's going to be cultural loss agreements, spiritual loss agreements, there's going to be a suite of agreements. We should have been, our trustee Canada should have been protecting our interests all the way through the development of mineral extractions in Canada since 1850 and before. And we find now through our research that our trustee hasn't done that. We look for the accounts where these monies are, and there is nothing in those accounts. So Canada can no longer do that. So we are empowering ourselves, and we will be looking after our own interests, and we will be establishing the revenue sharing agreements, resource benefits sharing agreements, et cetera, et cetera. We can no longer depend on Canada. That was an unhealthy dependency, and we're stepping right outside of that, folks. And we will look after our own future.
Alan Pope, let me get you to follow up on that insofar as we do have wonderful natural resources in this province. No, not oil, but we do have diamonds and we do have chromite. The Ring of Fire is something the current provincial government talks a lot about. Do you believe that as these minerals are exploited, that Aboriginal communities are getting their fair share?
No, I don't think there's any way you could make that statement and be at all accurate. There are significant constitutional and jurisdictional problems between the province and the federal government that the chief, I think, is alluding to. And those have driven a lot of court decisions on some of these matters in an unfortunate direction. Some remote communities do have an opportunity, as the chief has indicated. Others do not. The James Bay lowlands resource inventories show that there's very little there that can sustain, First Nation communities can sustain reserves. That being said, there are development corporations that do exist in many of the communities on the James Bay coast. Those development corporations have had some successes. The best one that I know of is the Moose Band Development Corporation, but it has invested in businesses where the resources are, and that's around Cochrane and Timmins, because there are no resources to be developed in that area where the community is located. And that's the problem with Saskatchewan. There were no available resources that could be utilized by that community for economic sustainability, for employment, for economic growth. Attawapiskat does have the Victor mine in the vicinity, and they negotiated an impact study and an agreement through their own legal representation with De Beers some years ago. And they are getting some benefit out of it, although there's some dispute as to whether or not it's enough, and I acknowledge that dispute. So again, there is development corporation work taking place. It is bringing income to the communities, to the bands themselves, but it's spotty at best.
Hayden King, can I get your view on whether or not you believe Aboriginal communities are getting their fair share of the jobs, the revenues, the resources, etc.?
Well, I think that they certainly don't think they do. A perfect example was last year when the Ontario government passed the Far North Act. As they were passing the act in the legislature, Anishinaabe Cree communities were protesting on the steps of the legislature. You know, there was a tremendous lack of consultation. Well, I shouldn't say tremendous, there was consultation, but certainly not enough to satisfy those First Nations. There was a lot of disagreement about the type of economic activity that was going to take place in the far north, the environmental destruction that it might bring, and First Nations' part in that economic activity. I think that you know, we could talk about resources like diamonds or chromite, but the point that was raised earlier by Christopher about more authentic economies is still a viable option. So if, you know, Saskatchewan and Attawapiskat don't have their share of enough diamonds, I mean, there are, you know, if regulations permit, provincial-like regulations, which we've got to change, obviously, you know, we can practice these more authentic economies.
Chris, what's your view on that?
Well, I think remote reservations. It's clear that that many remote reservations have.
Can I just check? You said reservations. Do you mean reserves?
Reserves, right?
Okay.
Remote reserves have
reservations in the States, reserves
yes,
up here.
of course.
Okay.
So, so a number of remote reserves have. Well, let me put it this way. I think that the natural resource issue is a big issue, and that has to be there. But I think the Crown has to work with Indigenous communities to figure out more creative ways of creating revenue that beyond natural resources. So yes, that's important. Traditional economies are important, but also finding creative ways. So providing First Nations with money to invest in economic development projects in urban areas. So giving First Nations money to build a cultural center in Toronto, which may generate revenues and jobs for First Nations. That money flows back to the reserve, or casinos. You know, they're talking about opening up a casino in Toronto. You know, giving remote reserves funds, special funds to invest in those economic development opportunities, which then creates jobs and revenues for the. So I think the point would be that First Nations and the Crown need to work together to pursue a variety of economic development activities.
Understood. Well, with just a few minutes left here, let me try one more thing. Sorry, go ahead, Alan Pope. You wanted to say?
No, I was just going to say, and in some instances that's happening, and in some instances it's not. So your guests are quite correct. For instance, the Moose Band Development Corporation did receive federal funding. It acquired Kasagami Lake Lodge in a wilderness park. It is now operating that lodge successfully. It's operating at full capacity. They have acquired timber harvesting companies in the Cochrane area and are very successful, earning a profit. That money is going back to Moose Factory, to Moosonee, and is having a significant economic impact on that community. And again, it was a cooperative effort between federal and provincial governments and the First Nation itself.
Okay. Chief Sayers, let me bring you in here with just a few minutes left. In the end, if people want to stay in remote communities, what do we have to do to make sure they're viable?
Well, first of all, I guess I need to say that my understanding is and I've had some of these discussions, and I wish there would have been another chief from a remote community who could probably really do good justice to the discussion. With my discussions I've had, they talk about relocation isn't the answer. And what needs to happen is there needs to be the proper level investments on reserves in the northern remote communities that take them to the quality of life that they all deem as a requirement as part of the original relationship that we defined through our treaties. And when I say that, I'm talking about it, and I know that not all parts of Ontario have the same types of resources as maybe around the Laurentians or around the Cambrian Shield, but I think we do recognize that there are an overlap, and we're all Anishinaabe. We were all supposed to benefit, not just this group gets this and this group. We're all supposed to benefit. Our quality of life wasn't supposed to be compromised, and there's this division that's happening, and it's happening
Okay,
with
Chief,
Canada.
forgive me. I don't want to run out of I
So
don't want to run out of
think
time without giving you a chance to speak to the actual question, though, which is if you want to stay in those communities, how do we make them viable?
you honor the treaty obligations that you, as the visiting people to these lands, have with us. I think there was a sharing relationship that needs to be fulfilled. And I look at a $900 billion budget in Ontario and an offer of $30 million a year as resource revenue sharing. That's a slap in the face. That's so small that it wouldn't even sustain us if we looked at, and that's 30 million over 5 years. That was really a poor attempt by Ontario to share our revenues from our resources. We're owed 50% of those resource revenues, not that less than 1% or whatever the number might have been. So we need to properly deal with the treaty, and Ontario needs to implement those treaties.
Understood. That's going to be the last word today. I want to thank all of you for joining us for this important discussion tonight. Alan Pope, the former Davis cabinet minister, on the line from Naples, Florida. He wrote the 206 report on the Saskatchewan crisis. Dean Sayers, the chief of the Batchewana First Nation, joining us in northwestern Ontario and Sault Ste. Marie. Christopher Alcantara, the professor in the Department of Political Science at Wilfrid Laurier University. And Hayden King, the professor of Indigenous Studies at McMaster University. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.